Hey everyone, this is David Pike, the Motorcity Mechanic. Now, a lot of you Dodge diesel owners have been screaming for more and more Cummins related videos. Well, I've got one for you. Actually, it's going to be a two-parter. And we're going to be dealing with the 6.7 liter Cummins from the years 2007 all the way up to 2012. And we're going to be removing and replacing the EGR cooler bypass valve. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the vehicle, open the hood, and go over the details such as who, what, when, and why. So let's go ahead and start with where the EGR cooler bypass valve is located. Now if you open up the hood and you get to the passenger side of the engine, just above the exhaust manifold and just to the front of the EGR cooler, you'll see this assembly right here. This is the electrical portion of the EGR cooler bypass valve. There are some steel braided tubes that go down with a steel braided cable inside down to a mechanical valve. That's the location. Now in order to get to it, we're going to have to take off this plastic cover that goes around the front of the valve cover, and we're also going to remove the rubber inlet that goes from the upper air filter box down to the turbo. Now in order to get the plastic cover removed, we've got to start with removing the dipstick. It actually goes through the cover. And then from that point, we got a total of 4 8mm bolts around the perimeter. Now all we got to do is lift up and clear the actual dipstick tube. Now with that plastic cover removed, I can now touch on some of the other key features related to that EGR cooler bypass valve. We talked about the electrical portion briefly at the beginning of the video. Now this rusted section right here is the mechanical valve. Now the reason why the two are not bolted together is due to the heat that's generated by the exhaust manifold. So what they've done is they gave it its own dedicated bracket. They moved it up and back. That way the heat doesn't affect the electrical portion of it. Now being that they're not connected physically, we had to come up with some kind of linkage between the two of them. And that's where this flexible tube and steel braided cable come into play. Now before we can get access to this, we still got a few more items we need to take loose. I already mentioned about the rubber inlet from the air filter down to the turbo. That will be coming off. We've got some heat shields that protect the valve cover from the valve. That will be coming off. And we've got another heat shield down here as well. We've also got the EGR crossover tube that needs to come off. We'll be taking this clamp off so that we can take care of that. So let's go ahead and move on to the rubber inlet from the air filter to the turbo. Now the rubber inlet has a total of 3 clamps we need to take loose. We got one up here at the upper air filter housing, we got one on the turbo, and we've also got a crankcase hose that splits off of this assembly and goes up to the filter. That has a spring-loaded radiator style clamp that we'll be taking loose. So for now, you can use a flat tip screwdriver or an 8mm socket to get this one loose. And then one further down, you could either use an extension or a long flat tip screwdriver. Just behind that rubber inlet that we just took the clamp loose, if you look down, you'll see a hose that goes up to this metal pipe. That's the crankcase hose leading up to the crankcase filter. This is that spring-loaded radiator clamp hose I told you we need to take loose. You can grab a regular pair of pliers or a radiator hose clamp plier set like this and actually squeeze in on it and reposition it out of the way. Now we can try wiggling that hose off. If it still doesn't come off, we can use an actual radiator hose pick. Now the way that a radiator hose pick works is they usually got a long, sharp, pointed end. They come in different lengths and different angles, depending on how you need to get to whatever you're working on. You're going to be working the sharp point in between the hose and the pipe. You're going to get in there and you're going to work your way around. Because over the years, the rubber kind of has the ability to stick to the pipe, and you want to break it loose. That way you can get the actual rubber portion off easier. Once you think you've got it loose, take it off. You can now reach down in there, grab the hose, and start working it off. And there you have it. Now we'll move on to the other clamp on the turbo. Now the tool that I like to use when it's time to take that clamp loose from the rubber inlet at the turbo is a long flat tip screwdriver. You can pick these up at any one of your local auto parts stores. Harbor Freight has them really cheap, so they're a tool that you can buy and you'll use it more than once. Being that it's long, I can get down in there and I've got more access to that clamp. That way I can back it off, loosen it, and then I can get the rubber inlet off. So now we can take that long flat tip screwdriver, or if you don't have one, a long extension with an 8mm. We can get down on the clamp right here at the turbo and back it off. So now we can actually take the air inlet off. Take it loose from the upper air filter housing. And then usually to get it off the turbo, all you gotta do is just wiggle it back and forth, lift it up, and out. So now we've got the rubber inlet out of the way and we've got more room to get to things. I'm taking the upper air filter box off. Now it's not necessary. I'm only doing this mainly so that you can see everything that I'm doing. So this is for the sake of filming. If you want to take it off, that's fine, but it's not necessary. So if you see it off, you know why. Now that we've got the air inlet out of the way, you can see that we've got a lot more access to everything on the passenger side of the engine. Everything from the mounting bolts that hold the bracket for the electrical portion. And also we've got another heat shield that I could only mention about earlier and couldn't show you. This is going to be needing to come off, and we also got the upper one we talked about earlier. So what I'm going to do is start soaking everything down with WD-40. Mainly the nuts and the studs that go for that shield, and also for the mounting of the EGR cooler bypass mechanical portion. We'll go ahead and soak those down, that way they can go ahead and get saturated, that way we don't have a lot of issues, because keep in mind that's where your primary location for rust is going to be. So just grab you some WD-40 and spray down the areas where the mounting studs are. We'll just give it some time to soak. And it doesn't hurt to put some on this clamp that we're going to be taking off for that EGR crossover tube as well. Now when it comes time to remove it, you could start with the bracket and electrical portion, or you could start with the actual valve itself. There is no wrong way. Either way, they both got to come off. So in this case, we're actually going to start with taking the bolts off for the electrical portion, get the connector taken loose. Then we'll move over to the actual valve itself and getting the shields off and the tube. Now on this side of the engine, we've got a total of two 10mm bolts we've got to take loose. This one and this one. That's part of the bracket that attaches to that EGR cooler bypass valve. Let's go ahead and grab whatever you're going to use, a ratchet or a cordless tool. And sit these somewhere where you won't lose them. Now moving on to the other side of the bracket for the electrical portion, you'll see that there's two 10mm here and there. Those need to be taken off. Not the one for the back, these two right here. So use whatever you need, whether it's an extension, hand ratchet, air ratchet, cordless tool, whatever it takes. Make sure to grab them, make sure they don't drop and get lost. So now we've got the two bolts off on this side of the bracket, and we've got the two up here by the valve cover. We now got movement in the assembly. Now we still got to disconnect the connector, which isn't a big thing. I'll show you that in just a second. But the other thing we might run into is depending on how this front clamp on the EGR cooler is located. Now it is a long threaded shaft with a nut. If it's tightened down and rotated in a certain position, that shaft might prevent this bracket from clearing and coming off. So you might have to back off on the 11mm nut there and actually rotate the clamp slightly downwards. So that way you've got enough room for the bracket to clear. So like I mentioned, we'll move on to the electrical portion of the connector. So now we're going to be talking about the connector and how to release it from the electrical portion of that valve. And this connector has a two-stage lock. And if you've seen a lot of my videos, you've heard me talk about these before. It's gray in color, but it's also got this red or orange piece right here. That is the primary lock. This needs to be slided over. That will release that, and then you can squeeze on the secondary lock, which is this portion, and slide it off of the component. Now in order to do that, you need to look real close at the connector. there is a raised side and a flat side on that red or orange colored piece. The flat side is what we're going to be sliding. So grab anything like a pocket screwdriver, anything that's got a nice flat tip on it. We're going to go over to the flat side and we're going to push over. And it may take some force if this hasn't been off in a long time. Make sure it's over completely. You won't see it exposed over here anymore, and it'll be over here more. Now that's released. We can squeeze in on the secondary lock and actually slide the connector off. Now when you go back with it, it's just the opposite. Slide it on till it's fully seated. You may hear a click, or you may just feel the click. Give it a quick tug, make sure it's not coming off. Slide that primary connector back over. Make sure it's shown on both sides. And now that connector is fully seated. So now all I'm going to do is repeat that same step on disconnecting the connector. Getting that done. And now, as long as that stud on that clamp's not in the way, I should be able to pick up. And I'm going to have to pull forward. And I should be able to clear that little pipe that comes off from the cooler to this down pipe and that rubber hose section and get it out of the way. So now the bracket with the electrical portion has been taken loose. Now we can deal with the mechanical valve and taking it off.